Joining us, everybody. I'm Sarah Hayes, and I'm the director of the Urban Tree Festival. I'm here today to introduce you to Eva van der Zand, who's joining us for our final webinar of the 2024 festival. So thanks very much, Eva, for coming along to talk to us. Eva's from the Netherlands, and she wrote her thesis on urban landscape. And she's normally delivers this as a physical workshop, so but today she's going to do it online, and hopefully you guys can all interact with her, and maybe a few others join us as we go along. And she's going to be questioning botanical language as part of her workshop today, so hopefully you can join in and get involved in that as well. If you could all be on mute at the start, and I'm sure Eva will instruct you if she wants you to join in and share. And I'll hand over to you, Eva, and thanks very much.
Yes, thank you very much. I will start sharing my screen. So, yeah, I hope you all see it good enough now. Yeah, welcome everyone. I am momently calling from the Netherlands. I started a small foundation on the border between Germany and Netherlands. And from there, I'm developing various cultural projects, research projects, all on the border of artistic research and ecology. And the most fascinating topic I have been working on is actually queering ecology. And the reason for that started from my own allergies and reflecting on actually what is in the air that is triggering in, like people say 30% of all people have some sort of allergies or hay fever. And I got so curious what is actually flying in the air that is triggering this, that I realized it's such an invisible part. Some people call it aerobiology. And when I dived into the background and the history of urban landscaping, I read a lot about that. It's really so little taking into account how allergenic a plant is. So actually, by also giving this talk today, I hope to inspire people to talk more about researching the allergenicness of a tree. So this is a small start. And yeah, to give a small example, what I do during the physical workshop, I give out people like small Petri dishes, and I let them make a very do-it-yourself way of collecting pollen, because I really believe in empowering citizens to do their own more scientific-based researches. And I make like a little bottom in it of agar-agar, and like this, the pollen really stick to the Petri dishes. And beautiful images come out on the microscope when I test it. So this is just an example of various pollen that I found in the city I'm living, which is Nijmegen. So just to give you an idea. And the hardest part is, of course, identifying the pollen. And also the interesting part is that, for example, tree pollen are quite easily to identify, but grass pollen are harder because they're too small to see under the microscope, because they all look the same. So for that, they developed a way of tracking the DNA of the grass pollen, and then they can identify what kind of grass it is. Yeah. And maybe you also wonder what is the relation to queering ecology or queer botany. And while I was researching this topic, I read about that there is some researchers claim that urban landscapers planted a lot of male trees in the urban landscape, and not everyone agrees upon that fact. So don't go out after this workshop saying that even patriarchy, for example, is in the urban landscaping. But in some areas, in some cities, people planted more male trees because, for example, for the ginkgo tree, that's a very specific example. And it also happens in my town. There's a full street with only ginkgo trees. And I noticed, maybe it's like 50 of them, that there's only one female tree, which is probably has been a mistake, and the rest is all female trees. because male trees, because the female tree has fruits that fall and then they start to smell very bad. Some people compare it to a smell of puke. And that's why, for example, urban landscapers prefer to choose from this type male trees and not the female trees, because it's too complex to clean the streets and it creates mess and people could fall and it's dangerous. But by making this decision, there's also a higher chance that there is a level of more pollen, because the male trees are the ones that in general spread more pollen, but also the not only the male trees, also the hermaphrodite, although this is now a bit of a question and term. I will show you later the overview of all the classification forms that are given in plant reproduction. See, yeah. Wait. Yes, I'm making this a bit smaller. Can you see all my full screen? I hope so.
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Yeah, I think to start with, maybe I really like this example of this old painting from Theodor Axentowicz, a Polish Armenian painter, saying, "Are you crying? No, I'm having allergic reaction to what? To life." I think the topic of allergies we can somehow all relate to. Maybe we don't all sneeze or get allergy from pollen, but maybe other topics in our life, or like how people behave, or how things happen in this world, or if you read some news happening in the world, you can feel an allergic reaction to it, or an emotional allergic reaction. So also I want to include the people who maybe don't feel allergies but are still interested in the topic. That it's an interesting topic to talk about. I don't know if you are all in the possibility to introduce yourself, because I am very curious to meet you also in person, because at the end I would like to invite you for a small writing exercise that we all can join in, and I can also maybe hear what your personal interests are and maybe share a bit more in that direction, because I can shape the coming hour a bit more in a personalized way. And my background is researching a lot of ecological urban landscaping topics. And next to that, I have a background in glass. So I did art academy as well. And I think a bit of focus on laboratorium glass blowing. And I really like how these two topics come together, because it's nice to also use a material as glass in my research. I don't know if someone would like to open the camera and feel like sharing, but I also understand when you are in a different mood and think you just want to sit back and listen.
Hi guys, would any of you like to introduce yourselves? Please feel free to unmute and jump on cam if you would. I think Kobe's still connecting to audio, so.
Maybe that's connection.
Hillary, maybe? Hillary, would you like to say hello, introduce yourself? Not sure if Hillary's got cam. Anybody else want to jump on and say hello?
Or maybe via...
I'm happy to, if that's if that's okay. I don't know if you can hear me. Yeah. Sorry, I was on the run before from an event, so I only joined a few minutes ago. But yeah, I mean, I was very interested to join this. I've been to various Urban Tree Festival events in the past, professionally. So I actually work for University College London. I'm an associate professor there in environmental policy, but a lot of the work I do is around urban green space and bringing together different kinds of knowledge and perspectives from all different kinds of people in how we design green space. So yeah, I thought this was just a fascinating talk and title, and I'm yeah, glad to hear and engage more.
Great to have you.
Welcome.
Rodri, are you about? Rodri's one of my interns, I can tell you that. Don't know if he's on, if he's about. Are you on camera, Rodri? No, he's not, I don't think, but Hillary's on cam now. Hi, Hillary.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us.
Okay. I'm in Manchester. My first thought was, or two lines of thought was, we have really poor air quality here, and various community and medical agencies getting together to raise awareness, combat it in different ways. But if you know, Manchester's, you know, an expanding city, so it's long history of pollution and industry, very few green or blue spaces. But I was intrigued really by the idea of the gendered words that, you know, traditional words in botany, because I often thought myself they're quite ridiculous.
Yes.
And a bit like plugs. So I'm interested to hear what the thinking is around that.
Nice. It's exactly what we're going to talk about. So great you're here, Hillary.
Unfortunately, the sound at my end is really poor, so I'm really struggling to hear. If there's anything you can do to improve it.
I'm not sure. How is the sound for
it's just it's quite distorted.
Oh.
Oh no, it's okay here. I think it might be your internet connection, but maybe Eva, you could be a bit closer to your microphone. That might help. Brilliant.
Yeah.
My internet connection is very good. It's not, I don't think it's that, to be honest.
It will be recorded as well. So in case it's really bad, at least we have a recording. So I hope it gets better. And yeah. Okay, thanks, Hillary. Are there other people that, Rotary, I saw shortly your photo. I don't know if you are.
Toby's just come back in because he's having problems with his audio, I think, so.
Yeah, some people are coming in and out. Okay, so maybe if last moment, or otherwise I continue talking on the topic. Yeah. If you all see my screen again, to give you a small introduction of the final work I did, where I kind of showed in a physical way the confrontation I had with indeed the terminology in botanical language. The main installation is where I made different plant-based milks. So not specifically of trees. I know we're talking here about the Urban Tree Festival, but I also dived a lot into other plants than just trees, but the trees has been the focus of the research. But it was just a metaphorical way, this installation, which I call a milk bar. So people could taste different kind of plants that relate to how plants reproduce. So there would be, for example, a milk from a hazelnut tree, because hazelnut trees are considered as monoecious. There I had some female milks, some hermaphrodite or intersex, they also call it. Like there is already a movement that the term hermaphrodite for plants is not really correct to use anymore. I think also in other terms for animals using it, but in plants as well. So they call it now in different books intersex, because it's flowers with male and female parts. And then you have polygamos. So for example, plants like banana have male flowers, female flowers, and hermaphrodite flowers. And then I have milk and asexual reproduction. So that's also an option. A lot of books I read inspired me to talk about this topic. One important one has been Flora Unveiled. It's a book sharing the history of the discovery of the denial of sex in plants, which was for me also very new to hear that actually for a very long time in human history, people thought that the whole natural environment was all female because of the goddess Flora. So they stopped looking at how nature was actually reproducing. So that shows also when we assume something or we have that is actually bias, we stop looking into detail for something. So when this discovery came out, some people say it was around 1500, 1600, then people, or like there was a group, mainly the church, they said, that stopped this fact to be known worldwide because they didn't want people to get more invested into the terms of sex terms into the botanical world. So they say in some areas it still took 150 years before the normal society was allowed to talk about these things. So there even has been a movement into history where this idea was blocked. Another book I refer to a lot is from Thomas Leo Ogren, and he wrote the book Safe Sex in the Garden, and there he writes a lot about how to take the allergenicness of a tree into account. Because, yeah, as I said before, some trees can be very allergenic and some trees not at all. And by people who have allergies, it can really have a huge impact if you decide to put only trees or maybe female trees and not a male version in your backyard, because it can prevent extreme allergic reactions. And next to it, maybe you should, it's also an interesting look on biodiversity, because taking the sex of a tree into account can also create a new awareness of even a more inclusive biodiversity, which didn't happen so far so much into the world. Another book is The Botany of Desire. And there is another one, Queer Ecologies. And that brings me to the visual I made, because I couldn't find one online myself, which maps out a clear overview of all the terminology. And this was also the photo that was seen on the website of the Urban Tree Festival. And my main question actually in this research is that I'm mainly curious to invite people to think along what could be alternative names for these botanical reproductive terms. And I mapped out the examples. So you have male flowers. They only have anthers. Just a little summary for some people who are not fully into it. I know maybe there's a lot of experienced people who know a lot about reproduction of trees and plants. So also feel free to share or to give extra input if I'm saying something wrong or if I'm saying something not fully correct. So please share your thoughts on it. Then you have the female flowers, and they only have a stigma, and they are under the name of dioecious, which means two houses. So the plant house, yeah. And then you have monoecious, which means then there is male and female flowers in one house or one plant. So for example, that is hazelnut. So they have different types of flowers. And then you have the polygamos, which I said before, it's the banana plant. So they have beautiful, in the banana plant, you see it really clear. the difference between the male and the female and the hermaphrodite flowers. And then you have as the more correct term became now intersex, but the old term is hermaphrodite. They have this, and actually in a lot of nature areas, the biggest part of nature is has hermaphrodite flowers or is intersex. So in some areas it's 80%. So then, yeah, a lot of plants are able to reproduce by themselves. And then there is asexual reproduction. So like, I don't know, plants like potatoes, they don't need to have sexual reproduction to be able to reproduce. And on the next page, you see the terms with line through them, because I think I understand why scientists decided upon the system, because it's kind of clarifies in a way, but it's also really labeling the botanical world based on our own sexuality. And often it's also, there's a lot of exceptions from this system, because in this whole system, it's not mentioned that plants can change or trees can change sex. So when I heard someone from Australia was there today as well, because the plant that inspired me most was the Australian bush tomato. It got discovered only a few years ago. And this plant was the first plant who got the term, actually, they say in a way, sexually fluid or gender fluid, but I think gender you cannot really use, because gender is more how you define yourself. So I would say it's a sexually fluid plant, because it can change almost every year or month. Like it can change very quickly from male to female. Every time the scientists encountered this plant in the wild in Australia, it changed again. And this quick change they have never seen before in another plant. It got this as first time this term. So I think it's a very inspiring starting point, that also maybe now in society we are accepting more of fluidity under humans, and only in this time they are also allowing to use this terminology into the botanical world. So for me, this plant is really a counterpoint in thinking about, in that sense, querying botany. Another time I got very inspired by the avocado plant. As an example, you see here the female face and the male face. So also what I would like you to take away from this talk today is that when you start eating plants at home again, if you eat the avocado or if you eat oats, to dive a bit into how these plants or trees reproduce, because it's almost like knowing the love life of a plant or tree. So avocados have intersex or hermaphrodite flowers, and they open at a certain time of the day. So here you see the female face and the male face. So the female parts are active in a different time of the day than the male. And knowing this while eating an avocado, I think it adds a very different dimension of this personal life, the flowers of a plant live. Then I put this example of the Jew tree in it, because it's I think a tree growing in the UK. And this Jew tree was 500 years or 5,000 years old. And after all these years, suddenly it started growing one female branch. And it was, for all those years, people thought it was a male. And then it suddenly starts growing a female branch with berries. And this example was quite mind-blowing, and also shows the complexity of doing research about how fluid plants are and why they change sex, because it goes over such a long lifespan that we're hardly able to research it. So it comes also with a lot of complexities. In the other visual, you see also a good example of the polygamous style of plants, which is the male flower, female flower, and the bisexual flower on one plant, and how the tiny differences, but they do differ from each other. Another typical plant when I start searching about plants that change sex is the hemp plant, actually, because everyone who has been growing, and in Netherlands, of course, a lot of people grow wheat plants because it's legal. So when you start searching for it, the wheat plant is the first plant that will pop up, because people struggled a lot realizing that they all had female plants, and suddenly they turn into hermaphrodite, and that means then the flower of the wheat plant shrinks. So often the flower of the female is quite big, and then when it goes into transition into a hermaphroditic plant, the flower shrinks, which means you have less wheat flowers to smoke. And then of course the people are really worried that maybe they end up with a little wheat production. And then they have all kind of tips and tricks how to prevent the plant from changing their sex. And as I shared in the small introduction, the example of the ginkgo tree, that has really specific difference between male and female. And actually the male pollen of a ginkgo tree are super allergenic. They even say that the pollen have a little tail, so that they can even move themselves. Most pollen just are dependent on the wind or on pollinators, but that ginkgo tree pollen, some scientists wrote about, they have a little tail and can even move more, more even, I would say, some people call it aggressive. I think that's a bit of a strange term, but they can move more independent and have an own will maybe as pollen. But very allergenic, so that's also good to take into account for urban landscapers. And the problem with the urban landscaping decision making is that there are quite some lists known in the whole world for the most allergenic tree and the least allergenic tree. But the problem with it is that the lists are not similar, which may conclude that maybe some trees are spreading more pollen when they grow in a certain area than in another area. So maybe it's never possible to have overlapping lists around the world. I think every unique urban landscape or outdoor area creates a different kind of ecosystem for a tree to flourish in, and also depending how much pollen are blown around. Here also just to get an idea of the kiwi, to see the difference between the male and female flower, and another image to see the female to male transition into an hermaphrodite or intersex flower. Another research that I found very interesting is the one where they did a research of 10 trees, and they were actually attacking the trees. So they pruned them, they gave them less water, and they actually damaged them in a way, and it really affected the sex of the tree. So it were 10 male trees, and then after 2 years, 3 became female, 2 died, and 3 became non-flowering, which is also a strategy of a tree to survive, and 2 became intermediate, which is also a different term for hermaphrodite or intersex. So I'm also very curious if you had ever experienced with in your communities or in your in the garden you work, or maybe some people take care of trees, or in the trees in your neighborhood, if you ever was aware of them chasing sex. So if you feel like making notes or reflecting on what you have seen, I'm very curious maybe to hear it later. Then I can share a little bit more about how this terminology came alive. This is a very known image on the next page, where kind of the hierarchy of anthers is shown. made by Linnaeus, the one who is quite known as the father, or the one quite known for coming up with a lot of terminology for the botanical language that we still use. But here you also see, in a way, of course, making an overview and mapping out and making knowledge available in a clear way, and adding hierarchy is an important part of being able to compare plants with each other. But as long as we are using and putting our own human sexuality and also our own human perspective on the botanical world, I think we should also be very aware of our own blind spots. And that's what I like to talk about with people. Here's another overview of different anthers. For example, an important example which started in the States now is that they address the different, the problematic part of naming plants and animals and not changing them. And this gypsy moth is an example, because in a time back then, maybe it was not a problem to use the word gypsy, but this moth got its name because it was, when it became into in a cocoon, it was moving a lot. So people said, oh, it's moving like a gypsy, so let's call it gypsy moth. Not realizing it is actually quite harmful for the gypsy community because of the historical background of them having been a lot of racism against this group. So in America, they started a database where also non-scientists can ask for name corrections. And some people think it's not necessary, but I think name correction in this world we live is essential to develop further as human beings. So I don't know of examples like this in the UK or in Europe or Netherlands yet, but I'm very excited about the possibility that we can have name corrections. And I think in literature also a lot of republishing is now done with republishing books where more damaging terms are left out. Which I'm more looking forward to a future where we are more aware of the language we use, because I think it really influences also the way how we take care of the plants around us. A very touching quote, for example, I found from Robin Wall Kimmerer, because she says in some native languages, the term for plants translates to those who take care of us. And it says so much about maybe our Western use of science and language, that we want to exactly identify the sexuality of a plant and how it reproduces. But it really, in this way, we don't really define a kind of human or a kind of more caring relationship with the natural world around us, but really objectify it. Also in her book, she refers to the fact that our Western language, maybe 80% of our words are not a verb, so very objectifying. But she is an author from a Native American background, and she writes that in her native language, almost everything is a verb, and in this way, everything seems like it's alive. And in that way, I think we would experience the natural world around us in a different way, because we acknowledge it's alive, instead of that maybe if you objectify it, you accept that it's dead. Are there any questions so far or input you would like to share?
Hi, Emma. We've got a couple of comments in the chat.
I will check.
Asked about the Australian tomato, was it you said? Which plant that in?
No, that's correct. Yeah, so the Australian bush tomato it was.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
She's also put a comment in about the UK Arb Association had a speaker last year talk about changing names to Maori names, and here in Australia we are only starting to talk about this. We have many clans, so over 100 languages, so it's tricky.
Yeah, no, I totally see the tricky part indeed of starting a discussion about name changes. Because, yeah, which language do you put above which language? But I think already acknowledging that there is a language challenge and acknowledging that maybe the Latin language, which is now used as a dominant language in our botanical system, is quite a harmful way. I think that's already a good beginning in opening up the discourse to different viewpoints. I heard also in some natural parks, I think in Canada or in America, that they stop referring to the Latin name, but start using native names, which I think is also already an interesting point to explain why a plant got its name. And in that sense, for me, that's the queering part, because in a way, queering to me means the right to self-define. And when you start supporting or keep on supporting the Latin language, it's kind of supporting the thought of the colonialist time using that language made up by a lot of male scientists. So how do we invite to let people self-determine? And even in the freedom of maybe when you have a relationship with a plant or a tree in your garden or a tree in the urban landscape, that you can also give it a term yourself, or build up a different relationship with it and observing it beyond the Latin name it has given. And I think like that we can open up new connections and relationships with the urban trees in our surrounding. But thanks everyone for the input you're sharing, very valuable. Do you see, if I'm opening, for example, the textbook, do you see it as well?
No, we don't see that.
Okay, so that you don't see. You only see the full image of my screen, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and the image on the right is from a female botanist, and she traveled a lot in South America and in Suriname and other places. And interesting part how she gives insight into how much people from different cultures are contributed to giving names to plants, but actually that their knowledge was erased. And she wrote a diary about how she did receive help from native people, even in coloring her botanical drawings. And this is just, it's so hard part of history to, because it's not documented, which people actually helped Western botanists to discover certain plants. But she refers to it that she did got help from native people to define the plants. So that's why I refer to her. Another interesting part, if you look at the sexual revolution developing next to the botanical world, is that a lot of botanical books written by women were used as also sexual educational books. And when I first read this, I was like, wow, that's quite incredible, because it's such a beautiful entering point in understanding maybe the natural world around you, or understanding trees in your direct surrounding, but also understanding yourself. Yeah, this is an example of a book that shares more stories about it. And And then as a contrary in that, because women were in, like were it had to in a way write secretly about it, because there was a huge part of male researchers who thought that women shouldn't be involved into botany because it would be too sexual and it would bring thoughts in their pure minds that awaken things that shouldn't be awakened. So William Whittingrings is, for example, someone who wrote this book, and he wanted to make botany widely available, but that woman readers should be protected from any mention of sexuality. And that shows again this weird complexity of how this topic is such a in history has such a strange impact on how it was allowed and then not allowed, and impacting how we relate to our natural environment. Also there's this author Alice Ettelmer, and she published Baby Buds, a 47-page on botany primer for children that doubled as a sex educational handbook. So that's the example I gave before as well. And her example for book also refers again of this strange two categories metaphors fall into, just like when people talk often about diseases, but also about the natural world, a lot of text right into the metaphor of making it sexual or military. And I think that is for us an important thing to reflect on, that maybe how would the botanical language sound like when it wouldn't have been made so sexual. And some other, I'm realizing it's already 74, so I'm gonna go quickly through it. And here are just some art projects of makers I'm inspired by that work around this topic, also around the topic of embodied ecology. And on the right you see from Macharu, it's an artist who maps around the world all different kind of cultures where there is more fluidity in sexuality. And here is also a very famous artist who made pictures of fruits, and then these were banned online because it was supposed to be too sexual. And there's an author who used her artworks as an example. And she believes that the categories of male and female were given to plants in order to reinforce white male supremacy and oppressive systems that persist in science today, which is a very strong statement. But yeah, it does show maybe the limiting reality of labeling plants in the male and female categories. And Orlando is a famous theater piece about hermaphrodites, and I added it as an example in making it in a way more how these terminologies has been used in a creative way in history. And here's another example, which brings me also to an important thing where a queer person reflected on how our when you study to become a doctor, the books are also very old school and very not queer in a way. And he designed a book where the anatomy is allowing more fluidity. And this also shows an example, I think, of opening up our thoughts on how we define the natural world around us. I think this is in a summary, a big part of what I wanted to share. This is still a small overview of how magnificent pollen are and how different they all look.